So welcome, good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here chairing this event today to really celebrate and share the exciting findings from DFID's flagship What Works to Prevent Violence programme, which is now drawing to a close after 6 years of really hard work, rigorously testing some of the world's, a range of different interventions and working with world's leading experts on preventing violence against women. And I'm saying this both as DFID's chief scientific advisor, where strongly believe in the value of investing in generating evidence to find what works to prevent violence. But on this occasion, I'm also saying it because at the start of What Works, I was on the other side of the table. I was part of this What Works team and really working with many people in the room and with Rachel and colleagues to say, actually, how do we work together to really work across so many different countries to generate evidence on what works to prevent violence against women. And as you're going to hear over the presentations that Rachel will share, the results are really exciting because they show that we can prevent violence. And very powerfully, we can prevent violence over programmatic timeframes. It's easy to think that to shift something like violence against women, it takes generations. But what this evidence points to is we can achieve significant impacts over project timeframes. And that's really important take-home message. We've invested in evidence in this field because we believe to really make change, we have to be generating evidence that tells us what to invest in and what we should do more of, and what are the things we should stop because they frankly don't work. At times when you work on something like violence against women, your gut feeling is we need to invest in services, we need to invest in safe accommodation, those sorts of things. It isn't always apparent of why we should support research. But clearly, we have to make sure that interventions work. And given the scale of violence that happens around the world, we have to think about prevention. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So as we end and draw towards the end of our time of the What Works programme, the critical issue is, how do we take this forward? How do we take the lessons that are coming from this research and really translate that into action? So I hope in the discussions that we're going to have after a series of presentations that we can really have a conversation amongst us all about what are next steps and what are the ways that each of you in this audience can think about the findings and take it back to your own work as we move forward. So we're now, before I hand over to Baroness Sugg, we're going to see a short video about one of the programs that was part of the What Works program. So this is the program in Rwanda, which speaks to that violence is preventable very powerfully. Cue video, I hope.
ubwo rero maze kumushaka nibwo byatangiye agenda amuhotera gutyo. Yabonaga ko umudamu nta gaciro agira. Nyuma y'amahugurwa ko twagiye twiga yagiye ahinduka, nagiye agarura umutima, fatira icyemezo hamwe nk'umugabo n'umugore mu rugo, kandi aranyubaha akananyubahisha. Nk'iyo mfite nk'itsinda nyobora ryo kugurizanya, ndi perezida waryo, nyobora ryo kwizigama no kugurizanya. Iryo tsinda turizigama tukagurizanya, nanjye nkabigisha ibyiza, nkabigisha aho navuye. nifuza ko abandi bagore bose nabo bagira amahirwe nk'ayo nagize bakabohoka kuko nk'uko nanjye nabohotse muri njyewe.
Great, thank you. That was a lovely video. Okay, I'd now like to introduce our Minister, Baroness Sugg. And Baroness Sugg is spearheading the work on gender equality across both DFID and FCO. And she's going to come and give some opening remarks. Thank you, Baroness.
Jumped on there. Good morning, everybody. It's really great to be here, and I'm delighted to open today's International Women's Day event. And it's really a year for us of a historic opportunity for us to really step up action on gender equality. And thank you for all being here to be part of it, and thank you ODI for hosting us today. I'm really pleased to have returned to government after the reshuffle in a role which now spans both DFID and FCO, and I genuinely feel privileged to be leading on such an important, ambitious agenda on women and girls, including a real focus on girls' education and sexual and reproductive health and rights, which are issues I have long been passionate about. And achieving gender equality is critical in the push to tackle exclusion, to make sure that we leave no one behind, to make sure that we address the root causes of climate change and poverty, and ultimately really realise the Sustainable Development Goals for us all. And I'm really pleased to be part of a government that is recognised for its global leadership on gender equality, and we will continue to make sure that we speak up for women's rights at every opportunity. But with that pride really comes with it a recognition that we need to do more, and we all have a responsibility to act. And empowering women and girls, standing up for the right of every girl in the world to have 12 years of quality education is a real priority for the Prime Minister, for my new Secretary of State, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, and for me personally. And we will be deploying the full range of the UK's resource and influence to really achieve that. And we know that we're only going to succeed that when all women and girls are safe and they're free, and free from discrimination, free from violence, free from the abuse that stops them from accessing opportunities that are really fundamental to development, opportunities like education, healthcare, jobs and political leadership. And of course, achieving gender equality and women's empowerment is one of the 17 sustainable goals. But as I say, it's also integral to all the dimensions of inclusive and sustainable development. I was really delighted actually to hear the UN Sec-Gen say exactly that last week. And he also said that macho posturing isn't going to save the planet. And I entirely agree. We won't achieve any of the SDGs without achieving gender equality, and I believe that before I came to DFID, and I believe it even more now. So our conversation today, set in that wider context, is a really important one. I'm really excited to hear more about the findings from our flagship What Works to Prevent Violence programme, and which will show that we can prevent violence against women and girls. One of the first international events I did, actually, I heard about What Works, and everybody spoke about it on the stage and spoke about what an incredible programme it was. And, you know, I felt really proud to be part of that. And also, this really is going to be a kind of global good for all of our international partners to use. And I'm pleased that we're the leading global investor in research to prevent violence against women and girls, including through our investment in this. And, you know, just hearing that 6 years of hard work from Charlotte on both sides of the fence, and Rachel and many of you in this room, just goes to show how much has gone into this. But it's such a great product that we know it's going to make such a difference in the years to come. And Charlotte's other point about making sure that we're making good investments is also really important. I am incredibly proud that this country spends 0.7% of our GNI on development. That was a commitment in our manifesto, and that will continue to be a commitment. But, you know, it's on me as a minister to make sure that we are providing good value for taxpayers' money, your money, which is ultimately what we're spending it on. So it's really important that we can show that these investments which we're making, these big investments that we're making, are actually affecting real change, and that's why this is so important. I really want this evidence to be a global good, as I say, but also a game changer and really kind of catalysing action and investment from our government, other governments, businesses, philanthropy, civil society, all the international organisations and anyone else in ensuring that we take the most effective approach to really drive down the rates of violence which we're seeing. And I'm keen, like you, to listen to our panel of experts. So I'm just going to focus briefly on three main points. First, reminding us why this research matters so much. And I really share your outrage at the violence that millions of women and girls suffer around the world. And what works really has reaffirmed the sort of staggering scale and the severity of violence against women and girls, and really the urgent need for a scaled up global response. We know that violence against women is not just confined to poor countries and conflict zones. And, we have had a very welcome spotlight on sexual harassment and abuse in recent years. And that's really reminded us that violence against women is universal, it's systematic, it's rooted in gender inequality everywhere, including right here in the UK. And that violence, we know, devastates lives and wrecks communities. But we also know, secondly, now that violence is preventable. We didn't know from the outset was how in practice to really effectively tackle the complex roots of this violence. But we do now have rigorous evidence that shows that it's a problem that can be solved and we can prevent violence. And it doesn't have to take generations, another really important point, in that as investors into this, we always want to see change quickly and we always want to see improvements quickly. And the fact that we can do this in a programme cycle is really exciting. And also that it works around the world as well in our and diverse projects and diverse countries like Ghana and Pakistan and DRC and Zambia have all really seen significant reductions. And that also leads to these multiple secondary effects on outcomes such as food security, girls attending school, women's earnings and savings, mental health, all of this evidence that preventing violence really delivers many benefits for development. And final point is that we really must scale up to end this violence. We know what works now, but that has been on quite a small scale. Now that we have this robust evidence and the insights to tell us how we have a unique opportunity to actually, and a unique responsibility to scale up on this. And we're really committed to use the UK's influence to amplify these findings as much as we can. And we're actively sharing this evidence across the UK government. I'm doing a similar event with a big internal audience tomorrow with lots of different government departments to make sure that they're taking this into account as well. And we're also going to be promoting it to our international partners. Sadly not at CSW next week, as that's sadly been cancelled, but we will use every opportunity we have. And I really want to help you champion this evidence in your own agencies as well and in all the networks that you have influence. And we know, as I said at the start, this year is really a crucial one for galvanising a scaled-up global response as we mark 25 years since Beijing, already 5 years since we signed up to SDG 5.2 to eliminate violence against women and girls. And the UK really is serious about stepping up our investments to achieve this. In November, we announced a further £67.5 million in new funding to scale up these proven approaches. And I'm pleased that this is the largest investment by any donor government. And in 2018, we also announced a £50 million UKAID package to tackle FGM, of course, one of the most extreme forms of violence against women. And we know that all of this, and they know that success is going to depend on putting women's organisations and movements really at the heart of our response. And that's why we provided long-term support to women's rights organisations on the front lines through our partnership with the UN Trust to End Violence Against Women. I'm delighted that we'll be hearing today directly from Dorcas, who leads the Ghanaian Women's Rights Organisation, the Gender Centre, and from the African Women's Development Fund, which is really doing really pioneering work to support women's movements across Africa. And we're using this evidence, as I say, to call for global action. One example is our collaboration with UNICEF, the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children, and others on the Safe to Learn campaign to accelerate action at local, national and international levels to end violence in schools so that girls genuinely are safe to learn. So 6 years on since the first ever global summit to end sexual violence in conflict, the UK, we're also continuing to draw global attention to that issue. And later this year, we'll be hosting a further international conference in London to secure renewed commitments to action on that. I'm also delighted to share with you that the UK have put ourselves forward to co-lead the Action Coalition on Gender-Based Violence, which is part of the activities to mark the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action. So assuming we get accepted, we're looking forward to really using that to use this evidence in the best way possible and drive forward change. So we see the Generation Equality Forum and the Action Coalitions as a really exciting opportunity to do just that. And the other thing, as we always have to remember, is the Sustainable Development Goals are universal, of course. We need to get them right here too. And we do need to take steps at home on this agenda. Today, we're reintroducing the landmark Domestic Abuse Bill to better protect and support survivors and bring perpetrators to justice. So I know that there's no shortage of willingness or expertise in this room. I'm determined that the UK and myself will continue to play our part with others in really driving the use of this evidence to push for a scaled up response and a scaled up effort to prevent violence globally. And I invite you all to join us, because together we need to work together in order to achieve the world we all want to see, so that girls and women do not have to live in fear of violence. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Baroness Sugg. That's great, great speech. I'm now going to pass over to Professor Rachel Dukes, who's going to give you a presentation of some of the key findings from the What Works programme. I don't think Rachel needs much introduction to many of you, but for just for completeness. So Rachel is the director of DFID's What Works to Prevent Violence Global Programme. She's executive scientist for research strategy at the South African MRC Council and has spent 20 years undertaking research into violence against women and girls. Over to you, Rachel.
Thank you very much, and good morning, Baroness, and good morning, everyone. I am so pleased to be able to come and talk to you and share these results 6 years after the start of our work, and to an audience that has so many people in it who played such an important role in this programme. And I put on my first slide some of the logos of different organisations that have played a part, but we can't begin in a slide to play justice to the contribution of partners to this programme. We have been working in What Works to Prevent Violence Against Women and Girls across 3 different components, generating knowledge on the prevalence and drivers of violence, on what works in prevention, and the costs of violence prevention, as well as the costs of inaction. And you see in this image on the right-hand slide, in red, we've marked out the many different countries we've worked in, 15 in Africa, Asia, and in the Middle East. And in these places, we've conducted 5 prevalence studies, 3 studies on the cost to businesses, 17 evaluations of violence prevention interventions, and 6 studies on the costs of prevention. And I can only share a few highlights today. The first big area we've generated evidence on has been the prevalence of violence. We hear the figure, we use it all the time, 1 in 3 women experiencing physical or sexual violence in their lifetime. This slide shows you the proportion of women in various studies reporting violence, physical or sexual, from an intimate partner in the past year. And you can see that in almost all of these cases, it was higher than 1 in 3 in the past year. The only exception being Ghana down here and Afghanistan, where we didn't have sexual violence. I've also shown you that at the far end, we've got countries where in our samples, 2/3 of women had experienced violence in the past year. And many of these countries are samples that I've marked in dark purple, are conflict settings. And we can see how much higher the likelihood of a very high prevalence of intimate partner violence was in those conflict settings. But you will also note that they were not all conflict settings. And actually, what it shows us is that there are many areas of the world where women experience very, very high prevalence of intimate partner violence. And these are conflict, but they also are areas where women are in other marginal groups, including being exceptionally poor. We also have measured non-partner sexual violence, and the figures on the with the central graphs and the right-hand summary are the figures from South Sudan, a conflict area. We had very, very high levels of women reporting having experienced rape from a non-partner. And in fact, 40% of the women who reported it had experienced it more than once. And we see that adolescents were particularly vulnerable. The prevalence is nearly 1/3 of women, and it was in the one setting Rumbek, who had been raped in their lifetimes. But again, I want to highlight the fact that there are areas that have a very high prevalence of rape that are not conflict settings. And in our informal settlements in South Africa, the very poor and disadvantaged women we worked in, reported that a third had been raped in the previous year. And it's also important to remember that this rape for the conflict-affected women, as for the South African women, is another form of violence on top of the intimate partner violence, which indeed is of higher prevalence. We've also looked at the prevalence of violence experienced by other marginalised groups, and in particular we've been generating evidence on violence against women and girls with disabilities. And we've shown analysis conducted on data from 7 studies in 5 countries that they have twice the risk of experiencing intimate partner violence than women and girls without disabilities, and indeed need to be the focus of programming going forward and efforts at both support and response and prevention. Our work has looked at the economic costs of violence, and we've shown that a major cost to economies has been productivity lost from working women who've experienced violence. For example, in Ghana, 64 million days annually lost, equivalent to 4.5% of employed women not working. A similar percentage equivalent in South Sudan, 6%. And we've shown that 1 in 5 women in Ghana and 1 in 3 employed women in South Sudan reported productivity loss equivalent to 14 and 10 days lost in the past 12 months, a truly large number of working days. Ghana, we saw the impact rippling across the economy, and a $1 loss of household income due to absenteeism led to an additional 57 cents lost from the business sector, which amounts to 1% of GDP. We've also been generating evidence on drivers of violence, and I think one of our big contributions has been to move the field forward from lists of risk factors into understanding what indeed are the real underlying drivers that we have to address. We've identified the role of gender inequality, patriarchal privilege and disempowerment of women, the normative use of violence in multiple aspects of social relations, central drivers of violence. But in turn, these are driven by structural inequalities as much as those inequalities also drive violence against women. And we've also identified the important roles of poor communication in relationship, poor mental health and substance abuse, early exposure to childhood trauma and abuse, witnessing mothers being abused, and indeed the context overall of conflict. And all of these interrelated drivers underpin the problem of violence that we experience in the world today. So in the first component of what works, we've been evaluating prevention programming, and we've looked at 4 groups of interventions. We've looked at community activism approaches to shift harmful global gender norms, roles, and other social norms, gender transformative and economic empowerment intervention approaches, prevention of violence against children, and approaches working with couples and special groups. Just to give you an example of work with violence against children, in Pakistan we evaluated a play-based life skills intervention delivered by the international NGO Right to Play. And we did the research in 40 schools in Hyderabad in Sindh province. And the evaluation was conducted with 1,752 girls and boys in grade 6. And they received the intervention over 2 years, and we collected data from the research over that period. And at the end of that period, we showed that this type of intervention to empower children to prevent violence can have multiple spin-offs on forms of violence. We saw a significant reduction in peer victimization and also in perpetration, in physical punishment at home, in corporal punishment experienced at school, and in a range of other forms of violence. And this shows how tremendously important this type of intervention is, particularly in a very fragile and generally violence-affected setting such as Pakistan. and the real potential of interventions like this with children for changing the future of a country. One of the great achievements of What Works has been being able to look across this large portfolio of projects that have been implemented in different ways, in different countries, with different groups. We've been able to evaluate them, and through their diversity, we've been able to see what works, what doesn't work, and also what are the features of the different interventions that have influenced this. And one of our most important products is the flagship report, which has drilled down into the design and the implementation of programs and said, what are the features that are commonalities across the ones that are more successful? And I think this has enormous importance in this field and probably in many areas of development beyond. We've identified 10 areas, 8 areas of design. The successful interventions were rigorously planned. They had a robust theory of change rooted in knowledge of the local context. They tackled multiple drivers of violence. And particularly in highly patriarchal contexts, they worked with both men and women. And in some of the settings, it was important we worked through families. They were all based on theories of gender and social empowerment and viewed behaviour change as a collective process and not as something just for individuals. They used participatory methods, group learning, both for adults and children, emphasising empowerment, communication, conflict resolution skills. The design was age appropriate, particularly for children, with an engaging pedagogy. They had well-designed manuals that thoroughly documented what was being done and what should be done, and they integrated support for survivors of violence. When we looked at the implementation, what was key is that the powerhouse of all of these interventions is the staff. They needed to be properly trained and selected for having gender equitable attitudes and thoroughly supported through their work. And we also needed to have interventions that were long enough, had sufficiently frequent sessions, and enabled reflection and experiential learning. So I think these are incredibly important lessons for the work that we do across this field. In addition to that, we've been able to produce a second flagship report, which has summarised everything that's known about interventions that have been evaluated to see if they impact on violence against women and girls across the entire field. And what we've seen is that now we do have a substantial, I think it was 96 evaluated interventions. And we're able to see from this image, which is the sort of snapshot image of it, that we have 9 different modalities of interventions that work. You would never use one intervention in every context. And so this begins to open up a portfolio of interventions that could be used as appropriate in different settings with different populations and really enable us to take a major leap forward in prevention of violence. These now need to be taken to scale. So I want to conclude. We have shown that violence against women and girls has a deep and enduring impact on the lives of women, their well-being and on economies. But it is preventable within programmatic time frames. We've shown we have a repertoire of interventions that are effective and can be adapted and taken to scale, and that robustly designed and implemented interventions are essential for success. I believe we're now positioned to make a real difference to women and girls' lives, and it is imperative that we seize the moment and we move forward with impact. Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who supported this journey, especially the United Kingdom government for funding it.
Great, thank you, Rachel. That was a really exciting and inspiring intervention. And there's a lot of detail you can see about what really are the key elements of what makes programs work. And I hope when we get to the discussion we can elaborate and pull out some of those deeper insights. So one of the things that I don't think we talk about enough when we think about evaluating interventions is the courage that it takes for interventions actually to come forward and say, let's really see if this is impacting on women's lives. And so I'm really delighted to have the next two speakers come and share their experience and the lessons that they've learned from being partners as part of the What Works research program. So our first speaker is Dorcas Coker-Appiah. She's Executive Director of the Gender Centre and ECRA, and she her program, the community-based programming that she leads, was one of the interventions that was evaluated as part of What Works. Over to you, Dorcas.
Thank you, Charlotte, and good morning to you all, and Baroness Sook. It's my pleasure to be here to share the intervention, to thank the UK government for the support. The intervention is called the Combat, which is a rural response intervention. It was implemented over 18 months in rural villages and small towns in Ghana. In each village, in the target group, we trained 6 people, both men and women, and we deployed them in each of the community to facilitate norm change on gender and VAWG, including awareness raising of legal rights. They also provided counseling to couples and support victims to access justice through referrals and other services. We also worked with the police, the health and social welfare staff, traditional and religious leaders in the prevention and response. We found it very important to work with the police and other state agencies because experience has shown that if the staff of the police are themselves not sensitized to the issue of violence, their response prevents more women or more victims from accessing justice. As Rachel has said, the intervention did yield results, and you can see from here. There's on the right, you see the figure which sees the woman descending the scale, and it's a representation of the actual reduction that was found as part of the intervention. And over the 18 months, we saw a reduction in women's experience of intimate partners sexual violence, 55% reduction from the baseline. Physical violence also reduced by 50%. Importantly, something that we normally don't talk about when we're talking about physical and sexual is the emotional IPV, which was also reduced significantly by 29%. Women's depression scores reduced by 20%, and there was a general report of reduction in men's or partners' controlling behavior. So for an 18-month period, I think this is quite commendable. In terms of key learnings, it's important that with any program intervention that is working in the community, that seeks to address social norm change, that it can only be effective when we work with the whole community. So in terms of our intervention, we work with men, women, traditional leaders, religious leaders, as well as state agencies, because all of these different groupings make an impact on the drivers of violence. So it's important that we take all of this into account in the prevention, any intervention that we want to do. Rachel has also mentioned that, it's important to carefully select, train, and supervise all the community facilitators that will be undertaking the norm change in the community, whether they're doing awareness raising, sensitization, or they are working and providing counseling services. We also found that it's more likely to be effective when the intervention is supported by, supplemented by support for the victims or for survivors. Because most of the time, if the survivor reports, they need some support to be able to undertake, take any benefit from the any services that are available. And lastly, the interventions are more likely to be effective when they are community-led, locally owned, and you get the support and rapport from all the stakeholders that are underlined earlier, the traditional leaders, community members, state agencies, the governance leadership. All of this is very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dorcas. And I'd like to now hand over to Prabhu Deepan, who will talk about the program in the DRC and something about the findings.
All right, thanks. Thank you, Charlotte. Good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to share, some key learnings and findings of the work in DRC, working with faith leaders and faith communities in the DRC. I will be sharing brief findings. You can access the, full report in the WhatWorks website. The intervention is focusing on faith leaders and communities, working in 15 villages, predominantly Christian church leaders and minority Muslim leaders as well. We trained, as a way of inputs, we trained 75 faith leaders through a 3-day training program. The idea is that how can these faith leaders, men most often themselves, be on this journey of transformation for themselves? The thinking is if they have good thinking and they believe in equality, then they'll preach equality. And then we also trained 30 gender champions as facilitators. These are men and women from the local congregations who are trained to lead conversations for 6 weeks. And then also we trained 15 community action groups who came together every month to support initiatives, also survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. Our trainings, addressed root causes of gender-based violence, specifically focusing on gender inequality. The idea is that this is not about just shifting tolerance for violence, but also challenging unequal power. And I think that's really important. This is not about how to teach people to be nice to each other, but really about addressing inequality. And support for survivors as well, and basic counseling skills, because most often we found these men and women would go to their faith leaders who are not properly trained most often to provide counseling, and whether we like it or not. So how do we really strengthen that, given the context, very rural, conflict-affected DRC in Eastern Province? We also, the community-led actions were really important because we are looking at shifting norms as well. Role modeling these behaviors is key. People are asking, how can I be something that I have never seen? So giving people something to aspire towards, specifically the men, was really important. Information sharing, community dialogues, and survivor support. I think one of the critical pieces for us also was monitoring and mentoring, because as Rachel presented, others have presented, the staff and volunteer commitments and their personal journeys as important as the work that we are doing. So instead of only monitoring, how do you continue to mentor and coach the staff and volunteers so there's continuous input in their lives as they are on this journey of unpacking some of this for themselves as well. They're not immune to the norms that exist in that community, and the research component to address and assess impact. Research findings, we saw significant reduction of intimate partner violence within the 24-month intervention period. This reporting is 69% at baseline. That's women's reporting. I think men are around 68%, to reducing to 29% at end line. Non-partner sexual violence reducing from 21% to 4% at end line. I think what is interesting to see is that when violence acceptable behaviors shifting at the household, it also affecting non-partner sexual violence. And I think that is a really interesting thing for us. And we also saw a lot of conflict within the community reducing as well. So that's an area we are really keen to explore further. Justification of physical violence dropped from 71% to 55% among men. Belief that women aren't allowed to refuse sex fell from 80 to 55%. Belief that men are superior to women dropped from 90. We used a lot of scriptural reflection as well, because most often people use that to reinforce this idea of superiority. So there's a lot of scripture-based reflections that we challenge the notion of superiority to promote gender equality. Using gender-based violence prevention as an entry point, but actually our outcome is that we want to go towards gender equality. That's what we are working towards. We also saw by end line 40% of IPV survivors sought assistance from faith leaders, and that was just 2% at baseline. And just to give the context is very difficult, so it's not a lot of services are available. So to see that level of not only trust but also people seeking support also showed that there was a level of stigma that reduced, and people were able to, survivors specifically were able to access services and share about the experiences without stigma and shame and blame. Key lessons for us. Multi-level diffusion model. I always say, people preach, in order to promote like eternal life, and we give them a toolkit, for 3 days. So it is really important that this positive message is diffused from multiple levels, and people actually believe, and that is the message that is reinforced through the multiple spaces. Spaces for critical conversations and reflections. This is about reflecting together as men and women in the community, in their households, and how this impacts their own lives and and their communities as well. Rooted within communities' own value systems. This is not imposing an alternative value, but creating the space for people to reflect from what they understand and believe, to see that this is compatible with their beliefs, and allowing that conversation to take place, and sustainability. Developing models that can be integrated and can be sustained beyond the life cycle of projects are key. And I think that's why it's really important that it's community-owned and community-led. What do we, have to explore further? Women's role as norm holders. There's a lot of internalization. Of course, it's inevitable. Years and years of internalization. How do we challenge that when women hold higher inequitable attitudes, where our focus sometimes, is on the men, on addressing toxic masculinities, but what about these, traits that women themselves expect and hold? Behaviors versus attitudes. We saw shift of, behaviors or practices. It's not proportionate to the shift in attitudes. So how do we, continue to explore that a bit further, and the institutional gaps and service provision given the context in DRC. So these are areas that we want to explore further. Thank you so much.
Fantastic, thank you. I'd now give permission for people up here to go down, and I'll bring up the next board. Where do you want to go? Just okay. Okay. We're going to kick off the discussion up here, and then later we're going to have a broader discussion with all of you here. So, to kick off the discussion, we've got 3 eminent panelists. We've got Claudia Garcia Moreno, who leads WHO's work on violence against women. That includes the landmark multi-country study on women's health and domestic violence too many years ago. And Claudia is also chair of the What Works Independent Advisory Board. We have Kalipo Mingiru, sorry if I'm not saying it correctly, who's chief of Ending Violence Against Women at the UN and is also a member of the What Works Advisory Board. And we have Jessica Horn, who's director of programs at the African Women's Development Fund. So what I'm going to do is just ask a few questions. I want your responses. So my first one is, so how do you see the lessons from What Works really changing and influencing the way that you do your work? And what do you think we, as a field collected here, should be doing differently? Who wants to go first? Claudia, I can pick on you.
Okay. Just because you know me.
Okay, that's right.
Well, first of all, it's really exciting to see such a room full and so much interest. I think I want to start by commending DFID for having really taken the leap of faith in a way to support research. Because even way back when we started the multi-country study to just document the problem and show how it impacted on women, people were saying, oh, but why do we need to study the problem? Give us the solutions. And I mean, people fund 10 years of research to conclude that oral rehydration salt works for diarrhea or things like that, and yet for a much more complex issue, they somehow think we can just produce. So I think having invested in finding what works has been a really, really important contribution to the field and a global good, as Baroness said. I think the first thing is that it gives us really the ability, when we talk to policymakers, to say, we have this body of evidence. This is a huge issue, but it's not insurmountable. There are things you can do. And I think that's very important, to change the discourse and the idea that, this is unsolvable, this is too complicated, it is, but here we have a lot of new evidence. So from an advocacy point of view, I think it's important. I think the second thing that is important when we communicate with policymakers is that the importance of evidence and of research. Because, you can't just rely on your gut feeling that, putting up 3 ads on the bus or that will change behavior. And really, we need the evidence, and we also need to understand that it takes time, it takes investment. It doesn't happen overnight, but it's doable in programmatic times, as people have said. And it gives us a menu of interventions on which to build. And different governments, different situations will be able to use entry points depending on the specific context. And I think that it's not just saying do this or do that, but it's really saying here's a whole menu of possibilities, and depending on your own situation, your own risk factors, etc., your own analysis, you can choose different entry points. I think in terms of what we might need to do differently as a field, or not, not necessarily differently, but in addition to, is to think of new partnerships and who do we bring on board that we haven't traditionally. I mean, it's very obvious for us to connect with the women's movements and with the NGOs. It's a little bit more challenging perhaps to engage with the private sector, or the business community, or the faith leaders. So think of those kind of new allies that we can bring on board, and who do not know the evidence and do not. So there's a whole, I think, piece around education. I think probably talking about faith leaders. So new partnerships and new players. And then another thing that's kind of my latest bug, that we still think in very linear ways about interventions and about change. And I think we need to really think more about systems. And how do we change the systems that are delivering different things? And because those systems in and of themselves are also patriarchal and are also reproducing gender norms and disadvantage. So I think we need to do a lot more thinking around that. And then how do we connect the dots? I mean, we're still a little bit, sort of looking at specific areas of intervention. And I think we need to look more at how do we link it all up together? And I can say a little bit more about that later. Great. One last thing just before, on the learnings, I think it came out from both the presentations from Dorcas and from Prabhu, that we shouldn't sort of see prevention or primary as totally separate from services. That we need to be focusing on, stopping it from happening in the first place, but we also need to be responding to all those women and families and children that are already experiencing the violence.
Great, thank you, Claudia. Plipu.
Maybe just to take it from what Claudia had just said, and to reiterate the fact that this body of work had incredible value for the work of UN Women. And it didn't have only value because it had to do also with the different interventions and the menu of interventions that it provided that they can work. But also, as Rachel said in the beginning, the fact that we have already the 10 elements that you described in the process, in the design, and the active ingredients. Charlotte, I'm stealing your term that I heard at some point in a previous meeting. The active ingredients for success, for how to have a holistic prevention approach to the programming we do, offered really incredible value to our work. And just to let you know, UN Women, for example, it has anti-violence against women and girls as a key outcome area in our strategic plan, and prevention is a very important component. So having this area of work being informed by this evidence is very, very valuable, because right now, the way it stands, anti-violence against women and girls is one of the largest areas of work of UN Women. And if we consider how it influenced the practice, for example, you may also be aware of the multi-million EU-UN initiative Spotlight, 500 million euro investment in 31 countries, in 6 regions. The evidence of what works informed this program, both for the theory of change that we designed and also for the 31 country program. So it has been very significant. And if I can speak a little bit from the perspective of the UN Trust Fund for Violence Against Women and Girls, we see that we have a great demand for prevention work. 2.5 billion out of the 3 billion of request grants for work on violence against women and girls is on prevention. So you can imagine how significant it is to invest on evidence for prevention. And 2/3 of the programs of the grantees of the Trust Fund, they are focusing on prevention. So it's very, very important. I think an aspect that is important, particularly for the UN Trust Fund for Violence and UN Women, of course, it's how do we make sure also that we bring the practitioner-based knowledge and experience to the forefront? And how do we combine the different areas of work in order to have a really sustainable change on the ground? And how to make sure that practitioners do not only use the evidence that we have been producing, but how they do co-develop and how do they co-create different forms of evidence that they come from the ground. The UN Trust Fund convened in 2019 its grantees, and we had 3 significant outcomes. One, it was that grassroots organizations, they need continuous funding in order to help them build their knowledge and to build the evidence and the practice they are doing on the ground. The second outcome, it was that we need some strong local research partnerships, that also it includes the local researchers and builds the local researchers' knowledge and experience. And the third one, and it's building on what Claudia had just said, on how do we really contribute to the prevention work by addressing the structural barriers at country level, meaning how do we help accelerating law and policy change, and how do we promote access of survivors to services in order to support the prevention work. And to this end, I think it's very important what Claudia was saying, because we have been focusing a lot on how to change people's behaviors and attitudes, but I think one element that we need to look into in order to have different entry points contributed to transformative change in the longer terms is also how do we change institutions, and how do we make sure that we integrate this kind of findings into the discourse and practice of institutions in order to address the structural barriers at country level, and also to contribute to evidence-based programming and scaling up the methods that we have seen that they work on the ground.
Great. Thank you very much. So Jessica, what's changed for you? How will this influence what you invest in future as a fund?
So we are a fund. So I represent an African women's rights fund, and so for decades we funded the constituency of feminist activists, women's rights activists, who have been the ones pushing violence onto the agenda to actually be a respected issue of action to be something that's actually in law and policy, and to become something that is now a policy priority. So I think for us, one thing that is quite powerful is to see the level of rigor that's been put into this work to really try and deal with these questions, but also the level of funding. Because in women's rights, we unfortunately are used to not having very much on the table when we're trying to solve problems. And so I think, you know, the level of commitment that the UK government is showing is something that actually we respect. As I said, you know, just early on Women's Hour, we appreciate the solidarity, because this is an intractable issue. It has felt like an intractable issue, and it touches everybody's lives in the world. And so we really do need investment to be able to deal with it. I think for me, listening to Rachel and listening to a lot of the evidence that's come out, it's an incredibly validating experience, because actually a lot of the conclusions put meat onto the bones of feminist argument about what the problem is. So that is ultimately the reason why violence persists in the way that it does and at the scale that it does, is because of these gender power relations that are actually embedded in everything. And that we have to deal with that. We actually have to deal with the questions of gender transformation. And the structural drivers around economic exclusion, issues like disability, right? All of those different marginalizations have to be dealt with, and that we can hold the complexity in the programming and make action. From our vantage point, again, what's powerful is that a lot of activists have the critique and have the analysis and have the call for action, but not always the what to do. And the other thing to also recognize is that there have been some activist organizations who've then gone on to this question. So the early prevention models that were piloted and went through the RCTs, I would say quite proudly, were Africans. Actually, there were African communities who were willing to take on the question and say, can we do this? So a marginalized urban community in Uganda, which is where I'm from, said, let's try. Let's see if we can actually prevent violence. And through the SASA trial, as we know, managed, right, to actually reduce incidents, but also change perceptions around, you know, women's worth in society. So this is really valuable. What we need to do now, though, is the bridging. So we recently hosted a convening of activists from across Africa, as well as some of the private philanthropists that are investing in this work. And it was apparent that there's the potential for people to kind of be left behind. So a lot of the pioneering women's rights activists who've raised the question and put the issue on the table, and a lot of people working in response, need to be linked into this prevention information. So for us, that's one thing we realized, that actually we've got a role to play as a funder of women's rights activism. We've got a role to play in ensuring that people have access to the information, are reading and you know, keeping abreast of the evidence, but are also getting involved as you know, program designers, implementing the initiatives, evaluating them, and producing knowledge. So for us, that's really, I think, the next phase. And, you know, we have funds like ours don't fund at a 25 million scale necessarily, but we do give the resources to the groups, and we actually touch, you know, a lot of places in Africa. And as I said, we fund the feminist front line. So from our vantage point, I think it's incredibly strategic. We have the constituency, and now it's a question of saying, okay, how can we now partner better to improve practice? And lastly, just to say, I don't think we can underestimate the sense of hope that the idea that violence is preventable brings. We cannot underestimate that, because people deal with the scale of violation and it can get overwhelming. So I think even just the idea that it's possible in a relatively short space of time, and that it's possible with this type of intervention, I think is in and of itself something that's helping regenerate the interest in working on this. And I think that's also really powerful.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, next question. I think I need slightly shorter answers just because of time. But okay, so how do we really get into policy change? How do we think about really using this evidence to change policies, to really see it through into programming, so that really this leads to women and girls' lives improving? Any priorities, insights? Go on, please.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think we have currently a huge opportunity to make sure that we mainstream this work into other sectors' work, and to do that in partnership with civil society organizations, and particularly grassroots organizations, that they know the best how to do this work within the different sectors. And it's very, very important, for example, to see how we can mainstream this evidence and this kind of work in the sectors of education and health. And to see not only how we can have prevention of violence against women and girls and support the survivors, but also how we can have other developmental outputs, such as access to education and better health for women and girls. And just a quick example from the UN Trust Fund experience in 42 countries the last decade, through the work of grassroots organizations to address school-related violence, they managed to have access to address school-related violence, not only by supporting the survivors and doing prevention work, but they did it also through a whole-of-school approach, and also linking with the community and the respondents. And also what the UN Trust Fund found is that also they used the grassroots organizations to identify entry points and to focus on marginalized groups of girls, for example, that they didn't have the opportunity to have education in conflict settings, for example, or girls with disabilities and so on. So these interventions not only had as a direct outcome preventing school-related violence and non-partner violence against the girls, but also they improved their access to education and etc. So I think it's a huge opportunity right now for us to mainstream it.
Thank you. Who wants to go next? Jessica?
Activism. I mean, there's no greater power than a group of citizens who know their rights and who can also demand of their government that the government is accountable to them. So I also see it from the vantage point of the African region, that, you know, the more people know and the more people have a sense that this is something possible, the more they can also demand of their own governments to take action. Every African government has a budget. It has a budget, no matter how small or how whatever it is, but it's got a budget. And so it can prioritize. And so I feel that activist demand is crucial when it comes to policy. And then we know how all the rest works. But I feel like that component is something we need to maintain in the picture.
Claudia?
Things. I think one, Jessica said earlier, bridging. You know, we need to translate the evidence in different formats and different messages for different people. And already I think that a lot of that has been part of what works. But, you know, again, like just to think who are all the audiences and how might we message them differently. And then the second point is political opportunity. I mean, like a lot of the change, big change, structural change sometimes happens because of some very extreme case, as we've seen in India, or, you know, so being ready with the evidence and being ready to take on opportunities, you know, as they arise. I think be prepared and use those openings. And then last, I think there are a lot of missed opportunities at present. For example, maternal child health programs. Lots of funding going into maternal child health programs, mostly without any reference to violence, and yet we know that is a potential entry point. And the same with, you know, education programs or schools programs. So just really being aware and trying to raise awareness of the opportunities for bringing the issues into existing programs without necessarily talking about a huge additional amount of funding, you know, just open up the dialogue. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Great, thanks. And last question. So, I mean, we've got a great body of evidence, but we don't have all the answers. So what do you think are the main questions and challenges that need to be addressed in the next generation of research investment? And I'm taking notes, by the way. Claudia, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think one is what I mentioned already earlier, that how do we move from single intervention RCTs to looking at implementing in real life settings? And even before we scale up, as we always talk about scaling up, but I think there's a joining up that needs to also happen maybe at the same time or before the scaling up. We have the small RCTs that have shown that this works here and this works there. How do we maintain that impact when we move it into a real life situation where we're not controlling everything, where we might not be able to train in as much depth as we, So looking at that, joining up, so maybe, I don't know, taking a district or a municipality and doing a multiple intervention approach so that we can look at that joining up. That was another idea, sort of modeling, model sites or something like that. We've talked previously, you and I, about how do we move from measuring single outcomes like violence to looking at the synergistic effect that some of these interventions, I mean, some of these interventions, we've only looked at whether they impact on violence, but potentially they impact on unwanted pregnancy, on, HIV. So how do we factor into our research more of that so that we can, show that an intervention has multiple impacts? And then just something that really struck me from Prabhu's presentation, that we are seeing big reductions, but the level is still very high, no? So you talked about reducing from 90% to 70% the belief that something about men being the decision makers or something. I mean, 70% is still huge. We saw in Pakistan that we reduced corporal punishment in schools from 60 to 30%. 30% of corporal punishment in schools is still huge. So I think we have to think about that. How do we get from these to, how do we get to zero, kind of thing. And I mean, yeah, that's something for the next generation of studies.
Great.
So, if I can add to what Claudia had just said, I think apart from the impact of interventions on violence prevalence in general, I think it would be also important that that's what we see from the organizations that the UN Trust Fund works with, is the impact of risk factors in order to design the projects in a specific way and also to have specific implementation modalities. And Rachel has touched upon this. I think it would be important to build on that. And there, I think the practitioner-based evidence on the ground would be very helpful to inform these implementation modalities and the project design. And of course, having a long-term support to grassroots and women's organizations would be very, very important in order to build that work. The third one would be, how do we really work to bring institutional change in the systems in order to help individuals to practice their attitudes and beliefs in a human rights related and free from violence and discrimination settings. I think also it would be very important to work a little bit more on how different groups of women and girls who have been having intersectional identities and have been facing multiple forms of discrimination, how can we invest more to learn? We have a universal risk of factors, but we know that for certain groups of women, we may have more particular ones. And the last one, I think it would be very important to see and build the evidence beyond just intimate partner violence and sexual violence to see other relevant forms of violence that we don't have a lot of information about, like sexual harassment, for example, etc.
Great. Jessica.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the points you raised at the end, really, about needing to keep investing in exploring how to prevent different forms of violence and forms of violence against different constituencies and in different kinds of communities. I think for me, one of the pressing questions is, how do we sustain the change? So I'm really keen to see what happens in the same communities. On two levels. One is that we know that backlash is persistent. So as feminist activists, we know that. We take one step forward, or 3 steps forward, but sometimes we push 2 steps back. So we're still going forward, but there is a pushback. And that backlash is real. So how do we deal with that, and how are these programs and interventions going to deal with that? If there's really a pushback to say, actually, no, we want these, same gender norms and ways of dealing, and this is what we're about, and this is what we want, because we see that very often in feminist work. And I think the other thing then is to think, as part of the sustainability, how do we really embed some of these methodologies in movement work, so that it becomes a popular understanding about how you intervene? That, for me, is one of the ways of going to scale. Because if you think about literally the scale, it actually literally affects all of us, okay? But fine, take your 2 in 3 or 1 in 3, it's still a lot of people in the world. Out of 7 billion people, it's a lot of people. So, I mean, you can't fund all of that, right? But what you can do is support amplifiers. And so how would you embed this in movement of people who are already concerned about equality in different ways and encourage that engagement? And the last piece, I guess, is how do we sustain innovation? Because one of the things I already see happening is the idea that once you got something, you just need to replicate and replicate it and replicate it, sometimes without thinking critically about context, about methodology, about maybe there's things you could add in, or even do you have an idea that could add on, right? Is the theory of change that worked in one context the same theory in another? So I feel like we need to really be careful about how do we sustain innovation and think about how we also build that into future research so that it doesn't just become a magic bullet idea. And only one type of approach getting funded, when in actuality we need exploration and critical thinking and imaginative ways of engaging this question, and to encourage that.
Great, thank you. Okay, we're now going to open it up. Before we do that, Rachel, I'm going to ask you to come up as well, so you can be in the hot seat along with others. And yeah, we're going to open it out for questions and any comments. We've got roving mics, pun, and hands, lots of hands. I'm also just looking for Girish. Ah, yes, there you are, couldn't see you. Who you're going to kick us off with a question. So Girish is CEO of ActionAid UK.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, and thank you very much to the presenters. Oh, sorry.
And just to say, I'm going to take questions in a bit of a bundle, sort of 3 or 4, and then in terms of speakers, just pick up the one that kind of most relevant for you, okay? And we'll try and get through a few rounds of questions, hopefully. Over to you, Girish, if you've got a mic now. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yep. Thank you very much, Charlotte, and thank you to all the presenters and Baroness Sugg. So as ActionAid, we absolutely welcome the commitment by the UK government and the leadership on the scale and the ambition of the program. I'm quite struck by the number of presentations which touched upon a number of issues related to depth, quality, and sustainability. That's the last point that Jessica raised. And my question is of how DFID would have considered or factored in some of those issues of depth and the risk of that being lost if we go to scale. And are we having any mitigating plans for that? And a couple of examples on that is, one is on the community-based social norm change program that a couple of presenters talked about. And the second one is about working with women's rights organizations who themselves are struggling with funding and capacities, and the kind of approaches we need to have so that they have the right capacity, there's the right expertise, and they're also able to come and negotiate and work on these large programs on their own terms in the context that best works for them rather than something that's just merely replicated. So yeah, it's a question about scale versus depth to ensure that the ambition of what works too will be actually realized in preventing violence against women and girls. But before that, thank you very much for the fascinating insights.
Great, thank you. Yes.
Yes, hello. My name is Andrea Bertone. I'm from FHI 360 in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for your presentations, and it's really very impressive, all of the learning that has happened. My question is about how do we either take what has been produced from the evidence and start applying it now to non-binary gender identity and also sexual preference. And I think that that connects to discussions around intersecting identities. I've heard, discussion around women, girls with disabilities, girls from other marginalized populations. But I think that we also need to consider more than just girls and women. We need to now be talking about people who don't necessarily identify as girls or women. And we know that there's a lot of violence in these communities as well.
Great, thanks, good question. Lots of hands. If I can get one on the other side. And then I'm going to come to that cluster in the middle in a minute, okay?
Hi, I'm Maggie Sandilands from IOM, the UN Migration Agency. Thank you again to everyone, and just fantastic to see the results. And just picking up on maybe Claudia and some of the other points around the challenges of going to scale, and particularly from small-scale interventions in more fixed communities, and then how we look at the challenges currently around population migration and displacement, particularly in conflict areas, and how do we ensure that the learning, we can bring in perhaps learning from other programs. I don't know if there's learning from the component 2 around working in these very mobile populations, and also potentially from some of DFID's other global programming, such as the Safety Support and Solutions Project, working in these contexts of migration.
Great, and I'm going to take one more question. The lady in the check jacket just here.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name's Jenny Yates. I work for the Elders. I wondered, particularly from the very interesting presentation from the DRC, to what extent this programme was able to look at to what extent the results are sustained. So within that project period, I understood there were significant reductions in intimate partner violence, but I wondered, did any of the evaluations go back later after the project had finished and look at whether those reductions had been sustained? And I had a second question regarding DFID's plans. I wondered what you plan to do now to support the continuation of this work or the implementation of what's been found. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take these set of questions and then get round for another one. So there's an element of scale and depth. There's issues of non-gender binary identities. There's issues of intersectionality coming up, and also about sustainability of impact. Rachel, do you want to go first?
Thank you very much for the questions. I'll work backwards. So I'll just comment on sustainability of impact. One thing that was interesting, and Prabhu can add to it, is that the final evaluation in the DRC was done about 2.5 years after the baseline, which in our field is seen as being quite a long period of time. So we found that as quite encouraging. There was one study which was in Tajikistan where we really did do a longer term follow-up, and in fact we went back to collect data 15 months after the intervention had been completed and withdrawn, and that was 30 months after the start of the study. And we found that by and large the intervention impact had been sustained throughout that period. And that was an evaluation of an intervention that focused on both sort of gender norm change by working across families with 2 generations, as well as setting up income generating activities. And we found that both the economic benefit of the income generating activities and the gender violence benefit were sustained. So we were very, very pleased about that. It's a key question and we need to do more research on it. So just to talk about migration, I think there are different issues there with displaced populations, and we really need to look contextually, because obviously one of the issues with displaced populations is that some of them are long-term displaced and it isn't short-term, whereas some of them are very short-term displaced and very, very mobile. And I think the answer to what needs to be done depends very, very much on the context, and particularly this issue about whether they really are a long-term or a short-term displaced population. What I would say is that our repertoire of interventions gives us a starting point, but it is incredibly important to look at the specific context, to understand the drivers of violence in that context, but also to understand the opportunities and the constraints that stem from the very specifics of the setting, and then to think about what can be applied. The second component did some work in those contexts, but it didn't amount to evaluation of a prevention programme. But they did look at the impact on cash being given to Syrian refugees, the impact of that on their ability to protect their assets and to protect themselves against violence. And there were some quite important and complex issues raised through that. And they also undertook a study in Dadaab looking at care services being provided there, which were rendered more complex by a move to try and close the camp when they were involved in the study. But it just shows how incredibly context-specific this type of work is, and it really needs to be subject to a lot more research and a lot more sort of critical thinking about what works in that setting. And I think I'll also comment on the issue about undertaking prevention work with LGBTQI populations, because I think, again, we need to look at the very specific settings. What we've got are elements that are very, very valuable starting points. And it's great having a start. But we then really need to understand the context and to really be able to think and conduct research and demonstrate what is really useful.
Great. I don't know if any others just want very quick points on some of the questions, you know, that maybe haven't been tackled. So issues around intersectionality, for example, or scale.
Yeah, just very quickly, just to echo what Rachel said, that I think the same as you were talking about different drivers in different settings, I think applies to different populations. We've done a systematic review on violence on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, and we need to understand better what are the drivers that are common and what are the drivers that are very specific. And happy to talk more about that. But I think in terms of intersectionality, we need to think really at all the different axes of discrimination which impact on rates of IPV. And we know, for example, that Indigenous women, we have data from Canada, Australia, from Latin America. I mean, clearly this is a group that has very much higher risk of IPV and other forms of violence. We know that women with disabilities, as we heard from Rachel. So I think we need to bring all those different axes of discrimination into our research and our interventions a lot more explicitly than maybe we are doing at the moment.
Great. And just quick on
Very, very shortly. Also, I think for both migration context and LGBTQI context, the broader context that Rachel was describing, now we get it more also into the institutional response to migration and to legal and policy responses for LGBTQI groups, that they would very much define as well the entry points that would permit this kind of interventions that we would like to have on the ground.
Jessica.
Maybe just a quick one about the question about depth and not losing that when we go to scale, etc., and also how to engage women's rights organizations meaningfully. So I think that the danger, because this is in the realm, a lot of it, the interventions are with public health researchers, there's always a temptation to feel like it's technical work. It is technical work, but it's deeply political. So I think one of the things we cannot lose in the process of going to scale is the politics. And what the politics asks of you is to actually do contextual analysis, to understand what are the power dynamics at play here and how do we work on those. I think if we sustain an understanding that ultimately we're talking about power and we're talking about violence against women, and we don't forget that, I think it's going to help us make sure that the scaled interventions aren't, paler comparisons to, what was actually done indeed. And we've seen that in practice with some of the take-up of some of the models already, that you can't cut it out and chop it up and take away some of the harder things. You have to deal with that messy, reality of people's lives and how we deal with each other in ways that are sometimes not very humane. And we have to talk about that and work on ways to change it. And in terms of women's rights organizations, absolutely. So one thing we found, we did a survey of over 100 organizations that we funded in the past, etc. And what we realized was that a lot of women's rights organizations haven't been engaging with this evidence base, and are not actually up on the discourse, the language, the tools, what is an RCT and all of that. To remedy that, one way to remedy that was we work with Raising Voices to produce a primer for African women's rights organizations that breaks down the information just in basic terms of like, what is this evidence? What are, the approaches? What are the key things? What are the learnings so far? And to keep doing that, and create and fund actually the process of enabling people to engage in meaningful ways so that people can be equal partners and are not just implementing partners, can also be part of design, can be part of feeding back on research and methodology, can be part of sort of critiquing results, and be really proactively engaged. But in order to do that, quite a lot of organizations do need to be skilled up, and that takes funding. Women's funds are well positioned because we fund that constituency, but I think that needs to be something that people pay attention to, that it needs to be also be funded. And we have to constantly make sure that whatever we're producing isn't too jargon filled. There's also, content that's made into language that, everyday people can understand, and language. We translated the primer into French, but just to remember that, again, a lot of this happens in English. And a lot of the world doesn't speak English. So to just think about how we also make sure that the results are being disseminated in languages that people speak and understand.
Great, thank you. And there was a couple of questions about DFID and what's next and what works. So Emily, do you want to answer those?
Yes. So to the question of, can you hear me? To the question of what we're doing next, Baroness Sugg in her introductory remarks remind us of our announcement of 67.5 million over the next 7 years, which will be starting, we hope, later this year. And actually, I'm really pleased to hear the questions and the challenges that you've been putting on the table, because they very strongly echo what that new programme is going to be addressing. And that's not a coincidence. It's because we've been listening and engaging with many people in this room over the last 2 years to shape that programme, and have enormously valued your insights and advice on that. So there's a couple of key elements to the new programme. At its heart is exactly this challenge that you put on the table about how do we take these small-scale, community-based successes and scale these up in a way that doesn't dilute their effectiveness and impact, and that is ethical. And we recognise that that is a really challenging thing to do. No one has done it before. It's really innovative, which is why we want to be working with really the experts around the world on this to provide that advice, and really to do it within the context of a programme that's all about research and learning, rather than just saying, off you go then, now you can scale this up. The other key element of this programme is innovation, and this really gets to Jessica's point. We know we can't just take, the handful of approaches we now have and replicate and scale. We really need to continue to invest in the questions that you've raised today. So some of the areas we've identified for innovation absolutely echo what we've heard. So we want to look at how do we get to zero? We want to understand the sustainability of impacts over time. We want to look at how we reach those groups that face multiple intersecting forms of discrimination, women with disabilities, but beyond that, contexts, such as conflict-affected contexts, where we still just don't know enough. And we want to look at other forms of violence. So innovation will remain a really key part of the programme moving forward. And the last big piece of it will be looking at exactly the question we've been asking today. How do we take this growing evidence base and use that to shape policy and programming? How do we put it in packages that are going to resonate and be accessible to women's organisations and movements, and ensure that they are part of our work moving forward? So happy to speak to anyone afterwards who would like further information. But in a nutshell, that's our ambition for where we go from here.
Great. I think, sadly, time is against us. It's 12. So I'm going to bring the formal discussion to an end, but just hope that actually for those of you who had burning questions that we haven't answered, that they can grab speakers afterwards, grab people in the room. But just to say, as a final sort of few reflections myself, I think, as people have said, this is actually really a time of hope, a time of opportunity. When we think about the issue of violence against women, often it's a terrible abuse. It's easy to think it's something we can't tackle, but clearly we can. Violence is preventable. We're starting to get those active ingredients. We're starting to understand what are the key components that make interventions effective. We now need to think about how do we take that to scale. There's clearly an important R&D element linked to that, of research investments, but there's also an amplifier that we affect that we need to happen, and we need to count and work with you all to think about how do we take the findings and the strong evidence that we have and really get that out and really tap into the different opportunities and networks that everybody in this room has. So we're very much looking to you all to act as part of our amplifiers. I really like the amplifier notion that Jessica was talking about. And lastly, to say that under Baroness Sugg's leadership, we're very committed to continue to play our part in driving forward the use of this evidence and to support the generation of further evidence to ensure that we can deliver a scaled-up violence prevention effort. The messages that we're getting from this research are powerful, they're exciting, that we can prevent violence, and we need to continue to deliver that message, but also continue to support the field to move forward and to use this as a spur to action over the months and years ahead. So thank you for coming, thank you to the speakers, and thank you for the great set of questions, and thank you to everybody who's worked on What Works for the past 6 years. That includes my DFID colleagues as well as and many other people in this room. Thank you for your work, it's hugely impressive.